That's entirely circumstantial. It depends on who my audience is. I would say that the vast majority of the time I identify as a lesbian, um, but I also don't hesitate to call myself queer. Um, Queer to me being a much larger umbrella term that I intend to mean non-normative, something that's not um, heteronormative. So I identify most of the time as a lesbian because it's easier for people to understand. Um, but I also don't hesitate to call myself queer. Well, I think there are probably really two parts to that question. One of which is that my gender identity and my sexual identity are two different things. And I think people often conflate the idea of um, gender identity and sexuality into one thing. I was very aware at a very young age, as early as I can remember, that I was gender deviant, that my gender did not seem to be the way I experienced my gender was not necessarily the way other little girls experienced their gender. For instance, I did not want to wear dresses when I was in kindergarten because I was rambunctious and I wanted to be able to play. I wanted to be able to do more active things. And a lot of the little girls were just um, doing quieter things. So I didn't want to wear dresses because I didn't feel free to move around in them, and I didn't feel free to play in them. I also can remember being in kindergarten, and I really, really, really wanted a pair of little work boots, like Tim's, like Timberlands, and I really wanted to wear those in particular. Um, I wasn't confused about I'm not um, a trans person. I didn't want to be a boy, but I did want to express my gender differently than was typical for most of the kids my age. So I remember being gender deviant from the earliest stages. In terms of my sexual identity, which was obviously developed later in my life, I would say that I probably began to notice that I was different, um, probably around the time, maybe fifth or sixth grade, when you start to really notice um, your classmates or other people having boyfriends or girlfriends or that sort of thing. I had a lot of boyfriends, but they were my friends. Um, that being said, I didn't say to myself, "Oh, um, I'm a lesbian," because I didn't know what that meant. I didn't have a concept of what that word meant. Um, so, but I did start to notice that I was different. Right about the time anybody would start to begin to notice their sexual orientation. So, like early teens or 12, 13, somewhere in there, I guess. I'm not sure I fully understand it yet. um, I, I guess probably, I guess I probably began to understand what the concept of being a lesbian was um, when I was probably closer to maybe 14 or 15 years old. Um, but even still, I had a hard time recognizing myself as a lesbian because I didn't know anybody who was a lesbian, or I didn't know anybody who was gay or queer in any realm, or at least I didn't know that I did. Um, so I didn't have a role model. The only thing that I knew about lesbians, my concept was like a biker dyke. somebody who was very hard and masculine and rode around on a motorcycle and had an anchor tattoo. um, so I didn't recognize myself as a lesbian because I thought, well, I'm not that. So, and that's what a lesbian is. So I'm not that. I didn't really know what to call it. I just knew that I was more attracted to women. Um, Not just sexually, although there was that, but also just I was more oriented to wanting to be around them and spend time with them and be intimate with them in ways um, that were not explicitly sexual. I was pretty quiet about it. I was pretty quiet about it. A couple of people in my life knew, a couple of my friends knew, but I was pretty quiet about it for a very long time because I didn't even have the words to discuss it. I didn't even understand how to articulate it. I don't even know what I would have said.
Yeah.
I don't even know what I would have said. Again, like I had a concept of what a lesbian was, and I knew I wasn't that, so I wasn't going to say, "Oh, I'm a lesbian." I just didn't understand where I fit. I would have to say actually that the vast majority of people that I told were extremely positive. I can't actually remember having a lot of negative experiences when I came out. Um, I would hear about I would hear about certain people being um, wanting to distance themselves from me from other people, but people were generally pretty good to me to my face. I did lose some friends. I had some teachers who had always been my champions, and they disappeared. It was very much still a taboo for anyone to be gay. So a couple of the teachers who had been my friends and who had really been my mentors suddenly just disappeared. Um, and I was made aware that there were relatives in my family who, um, were not supportive of the idea. And there were some friends in my life that I knew just instinctively that I was going to have to just cut off because I knew it wasn't going to be a positive experience for me to come out to them. I was the second person in my family to come out. My older sister um, came out before I did. Um, and so she kind of broke our family in, I guess you would say, to the idea. Um, I think initially our parents were um, surprised, shocked. Like us, they were in a small rural community and um, did not have a concept of what it meant to be a lesbian or what it meant to be gay. So I think there was a tremendous amount of processing on their part. Um, Everything from my mom having reactions that are fairly typical that you hear people talk about, like, oh my gosh, my kids are never gonna marry and have families, or just being confused because they are Christians, and they were um, not sure how to integrate their love for us with what their religious teachings had been. And I must say, in their defense, that they've come out swimmingly, beautifully in the end. But they did have, I think, some initial struggles trying to figure out how to integrate who they knew us to be as people, of people of integrity and people who were kind, and the same people they had always known, but suddenly with this new label. And I think they were confused about what it would mean every bit as much as we were confused about what it would mean. I definitely felt safe at home. In my community, no, I did not feel safe. I at the point at which I began to kind of understand um, that I was different and begin to kind of understand the concept of what a lesbian was, I was in high school, and I had experiences. For instance, I used to walk home from school every day, and it was quite a walk. It was more than a mile. And there was a group of young thugs, basically. They were all relatives that lived in the town where we lived, and I was walking through a used car parking lot where I used to cut through to go home. And they saw me, they were driving by in a car, and they saw me walking by myself, and they pulled over, and they all jumped out, and one of them had a knife, and they started to just say, very nasty things, calling me a faggot, calling me all sorts of nasty names, and um, basically chasing me, more or less. I took off running through the parking lot so that um, I didn't give them a chance to get close to me, because I knew they were dangerous and they were in a pack, and I knew that there was a good chance that they would egg each other on to hurt me. So I did take off, and I ran inside the used car, where the service station was, so that I wouldn't be by myself with them. I was followed around, for instance, at a gas station when I was younger. I had stopped to get gas, and I was in the convenience store, and a young man, came up and started following me around, like walking maybe an inch off of my heel. And he was just whispering things to me, calling me a fag, um, and threatening me, um, telling me what he was going to do to me. And that was another instance from when I was younger. So when I was younger, it was very clear to me that I was not safe in my community. No, absolutely not. It's important to note for me personally that I'm 45 years old. And so I was growing up in the 80s and in the 90s, and there's a market change between then and now, in terms of what kinds of outlets you had available, and in terms of what kind of support networks you had available. I did not know a single person that I would have trusted to approach at all. There were no, um, LGBT supportive um, student organizations. Um, there were not teachers that I felt like I could approach. I didn't know anybody who was gay. So basically, no, I pretty much felt like I was alone.
Okay.
And it has not changed very much, by the way, um, in my hometown. It is still a place that is dangerous when I'm there, when I walk there, when I'm occasionally going through there. It's very much the same. It's very much the same. There's a lot of hostility. A lot of education, a lot of education for people, um, community organizations, all sorts of different support mechanisms that could be introduced into that community and educate that community about what it means for a person to be non-normative, and what our basic human rights are. You get asked a lot of questions. You begin to understand just how much our society thinks of in my case, a lesbian identity as a sexual identity. We've definitely fetishized it as a sexual identity in particular. So I get a lot of those kinds of questions. Like you get questions about who's the boy and who's the girl. That's a very common question that you get that's just gross and inappropriate and completely ignorant. um, um, I get asked, I've been asked at what point I decided I was gay. And um, I didn't decide that I was gay. I just had, in my particular instance, I just seem to have been born that way. I seem to have just, that just seems to be biologically, psychologically who I am. Well, it's inappropriate because it's not an accurate representation of what lesbianism is. There are some lesbians who participate in butch femme roles, right? But I know just as many lesbians who both look boyish or both look girlish. Um, and there's just a tremendous amount of diversity in lesbian identity. And part of what's inappropriate also about um, the assumption of a butch femme relationship is that we're spiraling back around to um, assuming that a gender identity is the same thing as a sexual identity. And your gender identity is a completely different thing than what your sexual identity is. See, we all know straight women who look very masculine, and they're not gay, and they don't identify as gay, and their relationships are heterosexual in nature. We all know guys who seem more effeminate, and everybody assumes that they're gay, but that's just their expression of their gender. And so it's a very different. Those are two very different and separate ideas. So the idea that lesbianism is about butch and femme really boils down to an assumption that being gay is about experiencing your gender in a different way, and that may or may not be true. Um, Again, like we all know lesbian couples where both of them are very stereotypically feminine, or both of them look very stereotypically butch, or more masculine. So you really have to be careful about making this assumption that our identities are inherently gendered at the same time. There are a lot of laws that remain that are not in effect, that make me unsafe in the world and other LGBTQ people unsafe in the world. For instance, I can travel um, a half an hour south into the state of Indiana, and it's perfectly fine to refuse to give me service in any establishment. You can refuse to let me pump gas at your gas station. You can refuse to serve me food. You can refuse to let me lodge at your hotel, because that is a state in which there are no laws that protect LGBTQ people against discrimination. Um, so there are many, many laws that are not yet on the books that do not protect my basic human rights. Um, and it's also true that despite the fact that there are laws that do protect us in some places, there are a lot of places that you can go in this country um, where it is still culturally pervasive to have homophobic attitudes and to speak um, um, and be homophobic and deny people basic human rights. Um, so those things continue to be a challenge for us. Our basic safety, our ability to access basic human rights continues. One of the results, one of the results of actually having that legislature passed is that um, groups of people who are threatened by the LGBTQ community feel they immediately mobilized to to make sure that our rights did not continue um, down the path of acceptance. For instance, although we were granted the ability to marry, in many states, immediately very homophobic groups mobilized to make sure that we couldn't adopt, or that it was absolutely the most difficult thing in the world for us to access um, healthcare, for instance, even though we're married. Even um, they made it, they mobilized to make sure that it was difficult for us to um, have children or raise families. And we also know that once you are identifiable as a married couple, um, if you're gay or LGBTQ, any one of those things or all of them, you're immediately identifiable, and that help that is a signifier for people who want to commit hate crimes. Um, you are then visible. You are then identifiable as someone that they can harass and someone that they can make miserable. Um, so it makes you, as a downside, it makes you more visible, and an easier target, a more ready and visible target for anybody's inclinations towards being violent against you. All I can say is that I know a lot of LGBTQ people, and they are as diverse. They are as diverse in their lifestyle as any heterosexual people are. We all know that heterosexual people, let's say married couples, for instance, there are married couples who hmm, um, don't even live in the same house, or who, for instance, are not sexual with each other, or have open marriages, or any number of things. And the same is true for the LGBTQ community. So far as I can determine, there is not a definitive lifestyle that I know of. I have many LGBTQ um, friends who are married and have children. I know just as many who are resolutely single and will be for life. I know every variety of human being falls under both heterosexual and so-called gay lifestyles. So I would say that it's another code word. It's another code word that tries to insinuate that the way that we live is dramatically different than the way somebody else lives, and it's just patently untrue. It's also that that code word of the lifestyle is heavily coded to mean that you will take part in um, what I think of as a very Christian based right wing um, nuclear family. And the assumption behind that is that you will have a husband and a wife, and um, they will have a quote normal sexual relationship with each other that's closed, and will take place in a very specified framework. And there's this rampant fear. Again, you can see how LGBTQ identity is highly sexualized, because that's a code word for people who are non-normative in their sexual behavior, are somehow deviant, that they have multiple partners, that they're promiscuous, that they're taking part in some kind of sexual behavior that is that that particular group of people deems inappropriate, um, or or in some way wrong, incorrect. And so that's also a code word. in there that's being utilized against people to make them seem dramatically different, or to fail to acknowledge the fact that there's a huge, wide variety in any types of relationships, whether you're heterosexual or gay or queer or trans. There's just an enormous amount of um, diversity in the way people um, experience community, family, sexual behavior, that sort of thing. Well, it depends on, do I think Fox News accurately reflects uh, our community? I would have to say absolutely not. If you're asking whether or not there are representations of us in media now that are more accurate and more nuanced, I'm beginning to see that taking place. Um, there are still lots of cardboard cutouts of what LGBTQ people are, who they are, and what they represent. Um, but I am beginning to see some more complicated and diverse representations of LGBTQ people in media. Um, but there still are a lot of stereotypes out there. There are more in terms of when I grew up, there are many, many more resources in popular culture and representations in popular culture of LGBTQ people um, that you can access, and they are increasingly accurate, um, but also there are still a lot of stereotypes as well. Of the two takeaways that I can think of from the things that I've been talking about today, there are two things that come to the forefront of my mind. The first is I would like people to understand that I am still, in the most basic ways, not safe in the world. My rights are not necessarily protected. My voice is not necessarily heard. I am still prone to violence. Um, it is still okay to harass me. It is still okay to deny me my basic human rights. And I would like people to understand that they impact that on a day to day basis as they walk through the world. Um, and I would like people to understand this is something that my mom comes back to over and over. She has this little practice. Like, she understands that it's different for me to be in the world than it is for her to be in the world. But when I came back home in my 20s after being on the East Coast for a long time, she started this little practice where she walks behind me if we're out together, say running errands or just at the grocery store. She will walk maybe 5 feet behind me and watch what it's like for me to move through the world. And it really profoundly impacted her to see that it is not possible for me to move through a mall or a grocery store or out in the world without somebody's negative energy coming at me all the time. I don't get a day off because I look like I look and because I've chosen to be identifiable and out. Um, I don't get a free pass ever when I'm out in the world. Um, and I would like people to think about what their reactions are and how they impact other people, um, and how much attention they do or don't pay to protecting other people and being compassionate toward other people. Because I don't get a day off. I never get a day